I think that we have a good time to stop this part and prepare to a key lecture by Marcelo Vieta. He is right now with us. The author of a book about Argentinian cooperatives, which was published in Brill Publishing House last year. Workers' self-management in Argentina, contesting Neo-Liberalism by occupying companies, creating cooperatives, recuperating Autogestión, if it is good spelling.
Perfect.
Thank you, Marcelo. Marcelo is classical researcher in this area, because one of his articles about 10 years ago and the issue of affinities edited, yes, 10 years, it was 10 years ago.
10 years ago, yeah, the new cooperativism.
Was quite famous in the in this cooperative environment, and I think that very influential. And this book is an effect of your work from the last years, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
15 years in the making.
And this Argentinian case for me is one of the most interesting now in the world, maybe, because it shows that it is possible to self-govern and creating quite stable organization on the basis of social needs and very active democracy, in my opinion. Okay, Marcelo.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I am very, I can't see any of you, so so I can only see a few of you. Let me just let's see. Let's do this. I can see some of you. So there you go. I am really honored and happy to be the keynote for this very important conference. I am currently in Costa Rica. I live in Canada. Usually, we just arrived on Friday after many months of trying to get here. I'm on sabbatical right now. So my sabbatical was supposed to be in Italy, where I was going to do work with colleagues of mine at the University of Bologna, doing work on community cooperatives and worker buyouts and social co-ops in Italy. But after the pandemic came down and Italy was hit hard, I had, that plan had to be canceled. So plan B was to come down to our place that we just got before the pandemic in Costa Rica. And so here I am doing my sabbatical right now. So from me to you, pura vida, which is what they say in Costa Rica. I was born in Argentina, and so soy argentino, I'm from Argentina, but I grew up in Canada as an immigrant. And that's a bit of my background. I am an associate professor at the University of Toronto, and I study and I do research and teach on social and solidarity economies and cooperatives. I also work with the cooperative movement in Italy and Canada and in Argentina. And I'll get into some of those specifics as I go on, and then we'll have time for questions. So what I want to share with you today are the key findings from my book, which came out this year on empresas recuperadas in Argentina. Now, I the acronym I use for them, they're called various things in English: worker recuperated enterprises, worker recovered companies. I specifically use the word recuperated, and we can get into that later. And I use a Spanish acronym, Empresas Recuperadas. So I'm going to say ERT often. What I mean when I say ERT are Empresas Recuperadas por sus trabajadores, literally worker recuperated enterprises. So ERTs emerge from capitalist firms in trouble via workers' own motivations and efforts, and this is really important. Workers in deep conflict on shop floors and with their livelihoods at risk in the midst of a socioeconomic situation in turmoil or other crises issues, take over and convert their former employers' businesses to worker cooperatives. So I've been working with Argentina's worker recuperated enterprises, or ERTs, since 2005. I even worked at one of them for about a month. I mostly got in the way, but that's how I did my research. Actually, it was activist research. Started in my PhD in 2005, and I'm still working with the Empresas Recuperadas. So this is my book. Now the yellow is the hardcover, very expensive version that came out earlier this year from Brill. This better looking version is the soft cover, much more affordable version that's coming out December 8th, I believe. If you go on Amazon or Google Books, you'll see when it comes out. And it's by Haymarket Books. Now it's Brill Haymarket. So it's part of the historical materialism book series. Brill comes out with this very expensive version, and Haymarket has a much more affordable version. I want to specifically say that there's a Polish connection here in the cover of my book, and it was a coincidence, I guess, but the cover is by Leon Ciustek, who is a Polish avant-garde painter, he was a mathematician, philosopher, and this painting is called Miasto Fabryzyn. Excuse me for my lack of Polish knowledge, but so there's a bit of Polish connection. And I'm really, when I searched for a cover for my book, and it had to be an avant-garde painting, this one stood out, and it kind of captures pre-communist, the rise of industrialism in Poland, and it relates a lot to the industrialism that emerged in Argentina in the 20th century. So anyway, so I chose this as my book cover. So my presentation is based on the research and theories that I developed in my recently published book, Worker Self-Management in Argentina. It is research and theorizing that begins with the voices of the ERT workers, their ideas, their practices, and their creativity. From an oral labor history and political economy approach, the book ultimately develops a social theory of autogestión and new forms of worker cooperativism, which I will explore in this talk. My presentation will focus on the possibilities and prefigurations for another economy rooted in worker self-management. There are many difficulties and challenges to these experiences in Argentina, such as gender-based issues, continuities with explicit and implicit racism that one finds in Argentine society and most societies and in the working class as well. And the focus on formal work, right, versus broader notions of work, domestic work, unpaid labor, and that. But given time constraints, I just want to focus today on the promises that self-management in Argentina's ERTs offer for another economy, and what I will eventually term at the end, the labor commons, bringing connections to this conference. We can discuss these and other topics, hopefully, in the Q&A session. So how do we democratize work by converting companies to co-op? So, well, there are three major ways that my research has shown. And like I said, I've done research in converted firms in Latin America, Argentina, Italy, and now Canada. So the first I call labor conflict conversions. And these are the conversions that we find primarily, the recuperations that we find primarily in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. They're mainly worker-led, they're conflict motivated, and they're at first defensive. at first are to save jobs. And it's not a coincidence that they emerge in Argentina. And also we find them in Southern Europe. We find them in parts of Italy, France, and Spain. These are countries hard hit by neoliberalism and globalization and foreign capital taking over local industries. And it's not a coincidence that they're also countries that have strong labor union histories and histories of cooperativism, and they're connected. And that's why we find them in these countries. But we also find them in the US, we also find them in Canada as well. The second group are negotiated conversions, and these are primarily the types of conversions that we find in Italy, France, Spain, and Quebec. These are conversions that are underscored by clear laws and pathways. For example, in Italy, they're worker buyouts, so the workers can buy out firms that are in trouble. I've done research on this. You can look it up. I've mapped out what's called in Italy the Legge Marcora system. We find them in France with the CG Scops. They're often ways that workers can buy factories, and we find them in Spain and Quebec as well. Usually they have strong legislation. Like I said, there's a supportive cooperative sector. There's an enabling environment, let's say, or an ecosystem for conversions. And then we have partial conversions. Partial conversions are conversions that are partial in the sense that workers either have decision-making rights and non-ownership rights, or have ownership rights and non-decision-making rights, or have less of each. In the previous two conversions, workers have decision-making rights and property rights or ownership, right? These are the two important components that I use to decipher and decide how deep the conversions is. And I'm going to argue implicitly in my presentation today that labor conflict conversions, because of the struggle that workers have to go through, offer the richest form of the transformation of subjectivities in firms, because workers have to form a collective and struggle against many, many things, including learning how to be cooperators. Empresas recuperadas in particular are found in 6 countries, and I already mentioned these. These are the labor conflict conversions. We find them primarily in Argentina. This is one of Argentina's exports, let's say, to the cooperative world and to the labor movement. We find them also in Brazil, Uruguay, and France, Italy, and Spain. Today, there are around 400 ERTs in Argentina, and they include between 16 and 18,000 workers. Like I said, they emerge from defensive to offensive struggles that emerge out of crisis. The crisis, initially, when they first emerged, were both macro and microeconomic crises. That is, a macro crisis of the neoliberal system that radiated onto shop floors. But now they're mostly micro responses. That is, workplace is in trouble and workers take it over, and they know how to do it because of the previous history of these. Interestingly, and I found the same patterns in Italy with worker buyouts, ERTs are inversely related to the GDP. So the country enters crisis, the GDP goes down, the rate of ERTs goes up. This isn't an exact correlation, but it is a strong correlation, especially in times of crisis. ERTs are partial solutions for working people experiencing severe economic downturns. They show the tenacity of workers and the force of locally rooted economies. And they underscore research actually indicating that cooperatives tend to form in times of crisis, and they survive crisis well. They are firms that are particularly well suited because of their democratic makeup, and we can talk about other dimensions, to overcoming crises and reestablishing local economies. And interestingly, and despite the impact of COVID in Argentina, they are still emerging. Some are closing, but more are emerging as direct responses to COVID. ERTs are present in all urban economic sectors in Argentina and across the national Argentine territory, but they're particularly concentrated in the 3 industrial areas of Argentina. That is Greater Buenos Aires, Rosario, and the second and third largest cities, Rosario and Córdoba. The largest groupings of ERTs are represented historically by the most militant and activist unions in Argentina. So the the greatest conglomeration of ERTs, or the most ERTs, are in the metallurgical sector, foodstuffs, printing and graphics, and textiles. And it's no coincidence that these are also the most militant unions historically in Argentina. That is, the militancy for taking over a factory was learned in the social memories of past historical struggles that were based in labor struggles and union struggles. I'll get into the connections between ERTs and unions in a minute. So let me talk a little bit about the political economy of Argentina's ERTs. They don't just emerge out of nothing. They have a history, and they emerge in a deeper political economy. So as the severe form of neoliberalism that had immersed Argentina started to experience a meltdown throughout the 1990s, foreign capital took over the Argentine economy, and as local businesses found it increasingly harder to compete with foreign capital, small and medium-sized enterprises entered a historically high level of bankruptcies. There were mass layoffs, and unemployment rates soared to record levels. By the year 2000, we were noticing this in Argentina. In response, business owners, often in collusion with court trustees, began to engage in nefarious asset stripping schemes to stay afloat or seek to benefit personally from insolvencies. In this milieu, and with little prospects of finding alternative jobs, an increasing number of workers from a broad cross-section of Argentina's urban-based economy began taking matters into their own hands. They drew from this collective memory of past labor struggle on shop floors, and they took over their businesses to save their jobs as defensive maneuvers. By the early 2000s, more and more threatened workers' collectives would occupy the companies, clinics, factories, and workshops that had employed them, setting them to work again as cooperatives. So how did working people react to this? We saw how, I just spoke a little bit about how owners reacted, in that they massively unemployed people, and they would actually engage in nefarious acts like declaring bankruptcy and then stealing their own machines and tools and opening up shop somewhere else, or else auctioning off their machines while having declared bankruptcy, right? The workers caught on to this, and this is one of the things that legitimized their taking over factories. But also, ERTs emerged from a broader anti-systemic movements that emerged in Argentina at the turn of the millennium. This is how working people and the popular sectors reacted. Starting around 25 years ago, so before the crisis of 2001, a two-folded movement of resistance and renewal brought together Argentina's social justice groups, such as the piqueteros, which were unemployed state workers, neighborhood assemblies, the barter clubs, myriad community self-provisioning experiments, and ERTs. They came together in a kind of collective struggle against this system that has lost legitimacy. And you can view it as a popular attack against a nefarious form of neoliberalism. The piqueteros, without a workplace, these were unemployed workers in the millions, without a workplace, or in the hundreds of thousands, let's say, without a workplace to strike, cut off the distributive veins of capitalism, the streets, and they occupied the asphalts. And they formed, they would form cooperatives eventually, but they would organize collectively and democratically and horizontally, and they would cut off the veins, the distributive veins of capital in Argentina. And this is the way they struck. At the same time, the ERT workers would occupy the sites of production, right? The sites of production of capitalism, and take it over and cooperativize it, right? Popular assemblies would take over public spaces for recuperating local governments and democracy in light of a delegitimized and incapable state that wasn't able to directly respond to the needs of people. And then alternative currencies, when Argentina's economy collapsed completely in December 2001, and in the months thereafter, the peso was devalued so much and people would form local currencies. So the sites of consumption were also occupied and taken over. For a time, the popular sectors and working class in Argentina took back the Argentine economy. And this lasted for about 5 or 6 months, almost like a system of dual power emerged. What needs to be understood is that the popular rebellions of turn of millennium Argentina were not mere protests limited by a politics of demand. They were rather both actual counteroffensives by working people against the worst effects of neoliberal enclosure and experiments in creating new community-driven socioeconomic institutions from below. Both of these aspects were embedded in the collective cry of fury heard across the world at the time, especially when the economy collapsed in Argentina, declared default on its sovereign currency in 1920, December 2001. Que se vayan todos, that's everyone in the political, economic, and cultural and social establishment, leave now and let us kind of decide how to do things. And they managed to run things locally for a while until neoliberalism and the state, the developmentalist state, managed to recover itself. Implicit in this slogan and in the concept of autogestión I want to develop today was thus this twofold practices of rebellion and prefiguration, or prefigurative invention, which would bring together social movements like I just described. Autogestión, in turn, would eventually become the other side of this Janus face slogan of Que se vayan todos. Evocatively articulating the 3 stages needed to convert workplaces to co-ops in Argentina, some ERT protagonists borrowed from the slogan that's used by Brazil's landless peasants and workers movements: occupy, resist, produce. That is, to occupy the dying firm, often for weeks or months, resist repression from returning owners and the state, and restart production as soon as possible. The unbearable conditions of extreme exploitation on shop floors added to the increasing precarious life conditions of Argentina's working people. So I borrow here from a British Marxist historian, E.P. Thompson, in that what motivated workers and popular sectors to occupy and take over these sites, these economic sites and social sites, was a moral economy of work. I call this a moral economy of work, and I describe this in my book. That is when the laws, the rules, the social norms are so violated, the labor contract, that we are compelled as workers, right, to say, forget about it. I'm violating whatever laws I need to violate to secure my own safety and those of my colleagues, since the system didn't promise me what it was supposed to promise me. This is a moral economy, right? ERT protagonists would learn these 3 stages to autogestión collectively, informally, and in the thick of struggles to save their working lives. What they told me, the workers told me, sobre la marcha, or on the path of doing. And here they borrow from the Zapatistas, right? We learn on the path of doing. We learn by doing, right? We walk together, sobre la marcha. I believe Estaco talked about this, and I caught the last bit of his disco presentation. So as various ERT workers told me this, in the process, they have been recuperating the historical Argentine working class tactics of factory occupations and street protests that we saw historically in labor movement in Argentina in the 1950s, 1960s. This is a recurring thing in Argentine labor history. This is where ERT workers learned this and borrowed, adapted this strategy. The embrace of autogestión also links to ERT protagonists' social memories of other Argentine working class traditions, including a long history of activist unionism, cooperativism, union-based democratic shop floor organizing. So historically in Argentina's shop floors, you have things like internal workers' commissions, workers' assemblies, shop stewards committees. These are all common in Argentine shop floors, especially in unionized shop floors. And this is where workers kind of knew how to do this, especially the leadership, right? Those that were shop stewards knew how to do this. At the turn of the millennium, these social memories and working class traditions would emerge with contemporary social movement practices of occupying public spaces and experiments in collective self-provision and local participatory democracy. Autogestión then is the concept that embraces this, embraces all of these ways of recuperating productive life and one's livelihood in collectivity. Autogestión, it's also used in French and in Italian, right? It's the words that I use. I prefer this word. I learned from the workers of the Empresas Recuperadas. It's a much better word than self-management, although the publishers of my book forced me to use worker self-management because English language readers kind of might not understand. So I had to use worker self-management in the first part of the title, but then I squeezed in Autogestión at the very end if you see the title. So autogestión comes from the Greek autos, self-same, and the Latin gestio, or to manage, to gestate. In English, we know it, I think, inadequately as self-management. The Spanish, Italian, French word has much more of a political, biological, human, and other than human kind of aspect to it. Autogestión, right? It's self-gestate, to self-create. I think this is much more politically and ethically rooted. Autogestión is the concept that emerges from and further nurtures the twofold practices of rebellion against a system that's unjust and recreation, right? That eventually seizes the consciousness of ERT workers, articulating the recuperation, reproduction, and expansion of spaces of what I will call eventually the labor commons at the very end, and I'll describe that in a minute. Autogestión is a concept that was self-recuperated. The workers themselves recuperated this concept by social actors across Argentina. And this is how a worker that I interviewed in a Worker Recovered newspaper, he was the former president, Javier de Pasquale, described it to me. And for me, it's the best definition of autogestión ever. This is from a worker that lived it, right? That lives it continuously. Autogestión for Javier is the possibility that we all people have to realize ourselves professionally, economically, and in our capacities to labor. It emerges from within ourselves and together with the people with whom we want to share this realization, but without sacrificing personal freedom, without sacrificing personal dignity, and from our own developmental potential. It is, in other words, about the possibility of the full development of the person. In short, autogestión is the desire and lived experience of striving to self-determine a collective's own work and social economic destiny. But the path to autogestión, I don't want to paint a utopia. The path to autogestión in Argentina is still wrought with many difficulties. Argentina is still a capitalist country, although we have a left-leaning government now, much better than the previous right of center government. But challenges remain, and these are a small number, right? There are almost there are about 20,000 cooperatives in Argentina plus, and we have 400 of them are ERTs. Right, so why are we? Sorry, I believe there are about 28,000 cooperatives in Argentina, and there are 400 ERTs. So why focus on these, right? Well, I'll get to this in a minute, but they are amongst the most important and the most politically promising and prefigurative. But they are still faced with many challenges. Learning how to be cooperators. These are workers that had no idea about co-op. They didn't want to be cooperatives. They wanted to receive a paycheck, and now they have to be cooperators to save their jobs. Why? This is more responsibility, right? Restarting the production of depleted firms, lack of financing and capitalization, unfair competition in highly competitive markets that they still have to face, ongoing racialized and gendered issues against working people, but also within the working class. And these are struggles that they are also facing and they understand better, but gendered divisions of labor still continue, for example. inappropriate bankruptcy and business legislation, lack of adequate state supports, right? However, ERT workers have struggled and have managed by organizing collectively to reform or change business expropriation and cooperative laws to make it easier for workers in troubled firms to take over and create cooperatives. And now, with the new openings afforded by the new left government of Alberto Fernandez, we find ERT leaders, and this is a contentious issue in Argentina, in the ERT movement, in key positions in the Ministry of Production and the Ministry of Labor. So we went from last year from a government not recognizing ERTs and not being favorable to them and actually passing laws that were very destructive to ERTs to now having a very pro-worker, pro-working class and pro-ERT, at least they recognize them, that they even exist, government. That includes the recuperation of workplaces in trouble as a form of social assistance or a form of social justice, right? So ERT leaders are in key positions in these various ministries. They're also developing, with the leadership of ERT leaders, a new law of recuperation of productive entities. They're developing an official registry with my colleague, who I write with, Andres Ruggeri, who also has a chapter together with me in my book, and we've written together. He's now working in this Ministry of Social Production, in this kind of secretariat of Empresas Recuperadas, in developing a registry. Developing a registry is really important because you see how many exist, in what conditions they are, and what needs they have. So from autonomous, there's also the struggle. Right now in Argentina, if you're a cooperative worker, if you work in a cooperative, you're considered an autonomous worker. You're considered self-employed. So if you're self-employed, you're not given the same social benefits that you are as a unionized or dependent worker, right? You're called a monotributista, and this is not conducive. It's unfairly positions ERT workers against other firms, private sector firms. So these are some of the struggles that they're still facing, and so going from autonomous workers to being recognized as either dependent workers or another form of kind of recuperated enterprise worker or cooperative worker, that the cooperative worker would have a new kind of legal entity that would recognize some of the challenges faced. So social innovations. ERTs respond to the challenges and have reinvented what it means to work in what I call radical social innovations in my book. Social innovations are novel solutions to social problems. It's not about technology necessarily, although it might include it, but they're novel solutions to social problems that are more effective, efficient, sustainable, or just than existing solutions, and for which the value created accrues primarily to society as a whole rather than private individuals. That is, novel processes and novel outcomes for social benefit. I call ERT social innovations radical social innovations. Call them radical because they also directly they do all these things and also directly contest the worst effects of neoliberal capital and its forms of exploitation and strive to move beyond it. So I map out these radical social innovations in my book. It's an organizational kind of tool that I use to organize my book, the various chapters. But I want to boil them down to, in the remaining minutes of my talk, to 4 radical social innovations. The first radical social innovation are social and solidarity economic practices as collective responses to continuing crises and threats. So ERTs respond to their many financial and production challenges via social and solidarity economic practices, such as forming collective production and marketing networks between ERTs, in networks such as the Red Gráfica, the Mesa de, there's a kind of a group of ERTs from sectors or from different geographic areas or territories. Recycling the waste of one firm as a production input of another firm, rethinking the concepts of the what does it mean to grow? Do we have to grow? We don't have to grow. We have to secure our livelihoods. Why grow? You know, like what's this kind of, why scale up if the size of our firm is sufficient for meeting the needs of the workers, right? And building networks of solidarity where ERTs share production and even barter goods between each other. So even though they're engaging in competitive markets, in capitalist markets, in many ways, they're going against capitalocentrism, right? By engaging in other forms of collective economic exchange. In many ways, they're living the seventh cooperative principle, cooperatives cooperating, right? The second radical social innovation is more economically and socially just workplaces. Remember, these were all hierarchical capitalist firms that then got converted to a cooperative, right? So ERTs become infinitely more egalitarian and horizontal firms via their reconfiguration of their divisions of labor, decision-making, administrative structures, and remuneration practices. For instance, in Argentina, over 70%, probably more now, of Argentina's ERTs practice complete pay equity across its membership, despite the skill sets, right? Almost all are administered by recallable workers' councils and workers' assemblies, governed by democratic consensus. The president of the cooperative is one of the workers, right? And depending on the size, they're president full-time or part-time, depending on the size of the ERT. And they hold regular workers' assemblies either bi-weekly or once a month. And Argentine cooperative legislation says you have to hold the membership meeting once, an assembly once a year. They do it all the time, right? Other ways that ERTs are creating more humanized and humane workplaces, they're slowing down the pace of work if needed, allowing for flexible work hours and attending to personal business of the workers if they need to. Experts in an area of production lead that unit of production, right? They don't have to meet and have a consensus decision-making meeting for everything. That if you're an expert in one area, then you take care of that area, and we'll follow your lead. So there's this kind of flexibility in democracy, right? It's a pragmatic form of democracy. This is really important. They have reconfigured the working day, and they take many breaks throughout the working day. If the jobs are slow, then they won't work. If they don't have to sweep the floor, they won't sweep the floor. If they have to, they will, right? They take mate breaks throughout the day. Mate is the traditional Argentine drink that's in the lower left-hand corner here of the screen that we, in the southern cone of Argentina, we all drink, or southern cone of South America, Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, we all drink mate. This is really important. Bringing the mate back on the shop floor is a way of taking back working class traditions, right? Taking back from what the capitalists didn't allow them to do, right? And they take these, and I had many conversations with workers, and workers strategize. The members of ERT strategize often around issues around production and that, around the mate station, right? Okay, so the third radical social innovation, and for me the most promising, are these last two. Extending the workplace out, bringing the workplace into the community. And here's where we start to see a labor commons emerging. ERTs tear down the imaginary walls that divide the workplace from the rest of society as a way of giving back to the communities that assisted them in their most harrowing days of occupation. ERTs contribute to the socioeconomic development of surrounding neighborhoods by opening up shops to the community and sharing their workplace with cultural centers, K-12 and adult popular education initiatives, and neighborhood health clinics, for instance. And I'll describe this a little more if you're interested in how they do this, how they share shop floors with community initiatives in the Q&A sessions. But I have many stories of these. And the fourth radical social innovation is extending the workplace out into the community, or reinvesting surpluses into the community. Here, ERTs radically develop or radically kind of worked a radical form of community economic development. They are developing new socialized wealth and economies of place as well. That is, they share their surpluses in some of the most promising ERTs together with the community. One case study that's in my book, you can read it in detail, is Unión Solidaria de Trabajadores. This is the pictures that you see here, or UST, located about 10, 15 kilometers south of the city of Buenos Aires. And also Zanon, Zanon's another one. They dedicate considerable portions of their surpluses to community economic development and developing the local communities around them. So, for example, UST has created a community rec center and youth-focused center. They host local soccer teams and soccer leagues, football leagues for the local youth. But they've turned this massive 40-acre former garbage dump into a park, into an eco park that they share with the community. They've built affordable housing, as you can see here, the townhouses for those that were in less than dignified housing in their communities. And we can talk a bit more about this. So ERT workers embrace these radical social innovations in the concept of la fábrica abierta, or the open factory, symbolically tearing down the walls again that contain the secret work activity of the capitalist factory by becoming an open, right, and community-based work and cultural organization. So in my last few slides, Bibi, I'm almost done. I don't know how much time. I don't have how much time do I have? I'm almost done.
I think that 5-6 minutes.
Okay. So let's take a step back. And what exactly are, so the recuperated enterprises, what exactly are they recuperating? When workers convert a firm they did not previously own and control into a worker cooperative. I think there is a deep ethical and political moment here. And it's much more than just a workplace. It's much more than just a building that they recuperate. Recuperative moments, I call them. I added a seventh recuperative moment. I don't know, can you, I lost connection here for a little bit. Can you still see me? Okay. So the creative skills and capacities inherent to workers' labor power. That is, labor power is decommodified. By the way, this is my inverse reading of Marx. I inverted them. Marx, Capital is implicitly a political book meant to educate the working class about capital. If you invert what's written in Capital and from other places and other authors, you have to seize back what Marx talks about, is seizing back these sites of exploitation for workers, right? So decommodifying labor power. Surpluses that are created from workers' own efforts are taken back by workers. Associated labor and voluntary cooperation is taken back, right? The labor process in general, that is the act of working, tools of work, and the things worked upon are taken back by workers. Further, the social and technical divisions of labor, social production of social wealth, and ultimately workers' dignity. ERT workers, and really all workers who practice autogestión, take back labor's valorization of capital for themselves and for self-valorizing their own living labor. This is what ultimately is happening. And in the process, they're prefiguring another socioeconomic reality. Subjectivities are transformed. And this is one worker who told me, Cándido González from Chilaver, who told me exactly how he transformed. Looking back on our struggle 3 years on, I can see where the change in me started. It begins during your struggle on the street with nothing, and then suddenly you can see that you formed a cooperative and you start getting involved in the struggle of other ERTs. You don't realize it at the time, but within your own self, there's a change that's taking place. You realize it afterwards, as you start to do things that you would never imagine yourself doing. Worker subjectivities are taken back. They transform employees to self-managed workers. And this is not a small thing. This is a huge, huge step for workers to take, right? And ultimately, associated labor and voluntary cooperation. This is what Marx talks about this. He spends a whole chapter in Capital Volume 1 talking about cooperation, but he's talking about cooperation within capitalist factories as seized by and appropriated by the capitalist. They're taking this back, right? And there's sections of Capital in other parts of Marx's writings where he talks about associated labor and voluntary cooperation. But he's talking about cooperative work here. Cooperative, right? And also the very existence of an ERT is an affront and a critique, right? That this was once a capitalist firm that is now a cooperative is an affront to the most acts of capitalist workplaces. let me this. This